Welcome to another episode of Infographic Instant with Brian Michael. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the extent to which upper income economy governments engage in redistributive policies and therefore adjust their organizational structure accordingly, as opposed to adjusting their structure in order to deal with economic contingencies. As you remember, we have been discussing throughout this series of infographics about the extent to which government adjusts its size and structure to deal with changes in the macroeconomy and with changes in the overall distribution of economic resources. We've talked a little bit about isomorphism, or namely the extent to which changes in government match or relate to changes in the macroeconomy. In this presentation, we'll be looking at three infographics which talk more to the structure of government rather than the size of government. Looking first at the allocation of resources amongst various government policies, we see that upper income country governments tend to allocate expenditures more to social protection than general economic management and other issues. To that extent, we also know that these governments structure themselves so as to give social protection a larger role, both in terms of financial resources and most likely in terms of employment. So what you're looking at now is a stacked bar chart of the allocation of government expenditure across various sectoral priorities. So we see that while general government services are roughly the same between the two economies, we see a large difference in expenditures on social protection. These differences in expenditures naturally relate to the structure of government because we expect far more provision of these social protection services, number of buildings, number of workers, the type of capital that government uses to provide health care, pension benefits, and other social services. We also see that upper income countries spend less on public order and slightly more on economic affairs. So to that extent, we know that the priorities of upper income countries are different, and thus the structure of these governments is likely different. Turning our attention now to the way that structure has changed over time, the second infographic shows the amount of general service spending, social protection spending, and other kinds of spending in upper income jurisdictions. So we see significant volatility in spending on economic affairs, and we would thus also expect to see volatility in the structure of government and those structures that provide economic services. Looking at social protection, we see a much more stable time series, which suggests that the offices providing health services, education, and other types of government services are probably more stable in the upper income jurisdictions. Turning our attention now to the third infographic, we see much more volatility in terms of the spending on various policy priorities in middle income countries. So we see a large increase in spending on economic affairs, a lagged increase in spending on social protection, and following the trend, overall increases in spending in general government services. It's the volatility of these changes in spending which suggest that the underlying structure of government is much more fluid in these middle-income countries than in the upper-income countries. Namely, we expect to see far much more variation in terms of the number of offices opened, where they locate. Of course, they move where new population centers start to develop, and so forth. This suggests that the structure of government is far more fluid in these middle-income countries than in the upper-income jurisdictions. This has been another Infographic Instant with Brian Michael.